They laughed. At the dust, the boots, the absurd size of the cattle. Japanese prisoners of war, once engineers, sailors, and scholars, stood ankle-deep in Texas soil, scoffing at the primitive ways of American cowboys. The land, they said, was wild, the methods crude. "This is not farming," one muttered in Japanese. "This is animal taming." But the chuckles stopped the moment an old rancher handed them a deed. Not fake, not symbolic. Land. Actual land. The men stared down at the paper, the rancher nodding slowly. "It's yours if you want it," he said. One prisoner blinked. He hadn't touched ownership in years, only steel bars and barbed wire. Now, a field of his own? The laughter vanished, swallowed by something unfamiliar. Possibility. That morning they mocked the Americans. By sundown, they were asking how to plow. And they would never look at dirt the same way again. This is the story of how surrender turned into roots, and how enemies became neighbors. The horizon stretched so far it almost mocked the eye. Dry wind swept across the Texas plains, lifting red dust and the distant scent of livestock into the air. The Japanese POWs stood silently, squinting beneath the harsh sun. They had expected punishment, iron shackles, backbreaking quarry work, maybe salt mines or coal pits. Instead, they found themselves at the edge of a cattle ranch, staring at wooden fences, wandering steers, and a man in a wide-brimmed hat chewing the end of a matchstick. One prisoner whispered in disbelief, "This is farming?" The chuckles began quietly, disbelieving. In Japan, farming was ceremony. Fields were tiered and geometric, watered by systems so ancient they were poetry. Farmers walked barefoot, stooped like monks, brushing fingers through rice shoots with reverence. This was madness. Muddy boots. Barking dogs. And that cowboy, spitting into a rusty tin can and pointing at a stubborn mule like it was a tractor. The prisoners grinned behind their hands. One mimicked the cowboy's gait, another tried on a thick Texan accent and failed so badly the others nearly collapsed with laughter. They were prisoners, yes, but for a moment they were just boys, amused by absurdity. Their first task was hauling hay. One POW, a former Navy lieutenant, looked at the pitchfork like it was a primitive weapon. Another wiped sweat from his brow and muttered, "Do they not have machinery or even common sense?" The ground was hard and dry, cracked like skin long without water. The cattle stared blankly, unimpressed by the newcomers. They worked, but not without smirks. In their minds, American agriculture was brute force simplicity. The soil was treated like an opponent, not a partner. Their laughter wasn't cruel, just bewildered, the way one might laugh at a dog trying to play chess. But as the hours passed, the cowboys didn't yell. No whips, no punishments. When one prisoner stumbled, a rancher wordlessly offered a hand. When another winced in the sun, a canteen was passed his way. The gesture was casual, like tossing a wrench to a fellow mechanic. No ceremony, no gloating. That unsettled them more than if they'd been beaten. Later that afternoon, a cowboy tossed a bundle of work gloves onto a bench. "You'll tear up your hands without these," he muttered, then walked off. One prisoner picked up a pair, inspecting the leather. "Gloves," he said flatly, then repeated it in Japanese as if testing the word. Gloves from a jailer. It was the first time any of them truly paused. That night they sat on wooden bunks, the scent of cattle still clinging to their clothes. The sunburn on their necks throbbed. But it wasn't the pain that lingered. It was the civility, the absence of hatred, the absence of fear. One of the older prisoners, a professor-turned-logistics officer, spoke quietly into the dark. "Maybe," he said, "we are not here to be punished. Another replied, "Then what are we here for?" The question floated unanswered through the stillness. By the next morning, when they were handed simple tools, hoes, buckets, seed packets, they no longer laughed. Not because the farming suddenly made sense, but because they had glimpsed something in the cowboy's silence, in the gesture of a glove or a drink of water. This was not punishment. This was something else. And the soil beneath their feet no longer seemed like a joke. It began to feel like a question. But the answers they carried were not shaped by soil, they were shaped by fear. By the time these men stepped off the train into the blazing American sun, they had already resigned themselves to death. Not by bullet or bayonet necessarily, but by the slow, certain cruelty they had been promised since their first day in uniform. They were told capture was worse than death. Not only dishonorable, but dehumanizing. And yet here they stood, sunburned and sore, but alive, watered, and strangely respected. Back in Japan, every soldier had been raised beneath the shadow of Bushido, the way of the warrior. The code ran deeper than orders. It was marrow. It whispered that death in battle was sacred, that capture was failure, and that surrender was a wound to the soul of the nation. These were not just ideas, they were indoctrination. Even the camp cooks and clerks wore that burden like armor. In training camps across the empire, recruits were told American soldiers would torture captives, defile bodies, and destroy spirits. Better to die honorably, the instructors warned, than live as their dog. And so, when these young men, many no older than 20, were finally surrounded, disarmed, and taken in by U.S. troops, most believed they had entered their final chapter. Some even whispered prayers for a swift execution. Others flinched at every movement, expecting fists, boots, or mockery. Their fear wasn't theatrical. It was visceral. The rumors had come from every front. A corporal from Saipan spoke of Americans flaying prisoners alive. A gunner from Iwo Jima swore they sent men to labor in poisoned mines. Most of it was fiction, but fiction layered upon fiction becomes belief. By the time they were handed over to the military police, they had rehearsed every possible humiliation in their minds. And then, nothing. No spit, no shouts, no blows. Instead, the first thing they were given was water. A plain metal canteen passed from one sunburned hand to another. Cool, clean. One soldier hesitated. He'd been told never to drink from an American's cup, that it would be laced with something cruel. But thirst overcame dogma. He drank. The water was just water. Later they were led to long benches and handed trays. Meat, bread, beans, more food than they'd seen in weeks. Some poked at it in suspicion. Others stared at the guards, waiting for the slap or the joke. But there was only silence and the clatter of spoons. One rancher muttered, "Eat up, boys. Work starts early." He didn't even look at them. That night, lying in bunks instead of on the ground, wrapped in blankets instead of rope, the men didn't sleep. Not for fear of pain, but from the dissonance. The stories had lied. The enemy was not monstrous. He was maddeningly ordinary. One soldier whispered to his neighbor, "Maybe they are waiting. Maybe tomorrow comes the whip." The neighbor nodded. Maybe. But tomorrow came, and there was only coffee, dust, and chores. And every day that passed without cruelty chipped at something deeper than fear. It chipped at faith. Not religious faith, but the faith they had placed in their homeland stories, the ones that painted Americans as beasts. Now, each moment of civility unraveled that myth. And for the first time, the enemy began to look human. That realization did not bloom all at once. It came in inches, a gesture here, a glance there, seeded in sweat, dust, and the strangest place of all, the birthing stall of a cow. It was early morning, the air still cool, steam rising from the backs of the cattle in the pen. One of the older ranchers barked a few sharp syllables of English the prisoners didn't understand, but they recognized the urgency in his voice. A heifer was in labor, legs trembling, eyes wide with something ancient and panicked. One POW, a former fisherman from Nagasaki named Hiroshi, was shoved forward by the cowboy and handed a pair of thick gloves. He didn't know what to do, but the cowboy placed his hands on Hiroshi's and guided them gently. It was slow, clumsy, soaked in sweat and fear. Then movement. A slick, wet calf slid free and gasped its first breath into the morning air. Hiroshi fell to his knees, hands shaking, the smell of birth thick around him. His eyes welled up. He had seen death in war. Now here was life, wriggling and blind, resting against the hay. The cowboy gave him a nod, not unkind. Hiroshi nodded back. From that moment the ridicule began to fade, not from defeat, but from awe. The work didn't get easier, but it changed shape. They milked, they mended fences, they shooed stubborn cows into corrals and learned to read the sky like scripture. The cowboys didn't explain things the way Japanese farmers would. They didn't speak in lessons, only in examples. They'd hand over a tool, grunt, and gesture. The rest was trial and error. But in that silence grew something unexpected: trust. Shared labor became shared rhythm. In the heat of midday, both cowboy and prisoner wiped their brows with the same rough sleeves. In the quiet of the evening, they leaned on fence posts, side by side, watching cattle graze under a melting sky. One POW named Kazuo, who had once studied engineering in Kyoto, began waking earlier than the others to sharpen tools left dull by the ranch hands. Another, Takashi, started correcting the spacing of seed rows with subtle adjustments, and the Americans noticed. They didn't say much, just a grunt, a look, sometimes a slow nod. But it was enough. The language barrier remained, but slowly even that began to crack. The POWs picked up words: gate, fence, feed, water. The cowboys learned phrases like "hey over there" and "good job." One day, a young ranch hand tried to explain the word branding and pantomimed fire, then stamped his own boot with a stick. The prisoners burst into laughter. It was the first time since arrival that the sound wasn't bitter or mocking. It was real. That night, they mimicked the cowboys with exaggerated accents, drawing laughter from their own ranks. One even tied his bandana around his face like an outlaw and tried to lasso a bunkmate with twine. He missed entirely, landing flat on his chest. The barracks erupted in gasps, then chuckles. Even the guard outside cracked a smile. What began as scorn had shifted. The work was still hard, the language still foreign. But it no longer felt like captivity. It was becoming a conversation, one built not from words, but from blisters and sunburns, from jokes fumbled across language lines, from watching a calf take its first steps and realizing the world was bigger than the war they had come from. And within that strange new world, doubt began to grow. Not loudly, not in speeches or arguments, but in glances, hesitations, and the quiet shifting of routines. At night, beneath the low hum of insects and the rustle of bunk sheets, something else stirred, a kind of silence too heavy to be sleep. The men still rose at dawn, still shoveled and milked and fixed fences, but behind their eyes something had cracked open, something they didn't yet have the words for. Kazuo, the former engineering student from Kyoto, started keeping notes, not just scribbles, but structured observations, soil conditions, planting distances, feed rotations. He wrote in a small booklet torn from an old ledger, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard under his bunk. It wasn't permitted, but he couldn't help himself. The farm was a system, and systems could be studied, but beneath the neat columns and ink-stained lines was a deeper truth he dared not write down. He admired the way the Americans worked the land, not because it was efficient, because it was human. Each night he added a few lines, watching the others to make sure no one noticed. Some might have called him a traitor, even now. Others might have understood. But for now, the journal remained a secret, a quiet rebellion not against America, but against everything they had once believed about it. Elsewhere in the barracks, murmurs replaced mockery. "Did you see the way that cowboy treated the lame calf today?" one man whispered to another. "Like it was his own child." Another added, "He offered me water without being asked, just saw I was tired." These weren't complaints. They were confessions. Quiet admissions that the line between captor and companion was beginning to blur. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some still spat when they saw the American flag, still cursed under their breath during roll call. They clung to the past like a lifeline, the version of the world where righteousness had a flag and enemies were monsters. But even they couldn't ignore the shift in the air. Too much had changed. The turning point for many came when the first letters home were allowed. Paper was rationed, pencils dull, but the opportunity felt like a gift too fragile to question. Kazuo sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time before writing. He didn't mention dishonor. He didn't speak of barbed wire. He wrote instead about rows of corn stretching into the horizon, about a cowboy showing him how to check for soil moisture using only his fingers. He ended with a single sentence that trembled across the page. "I do not understand this war anymore." He sealed the letter with care, unsure if it would ever reach his mother, or if it would be intercepted and burned by Japanese censors. But for the first time, he wasn't writing to justify survival. He was writing to describe something that felt like growth. Later that night, a guard paused by the barracks and nodded to one of the prisoners. Not a command, just a nod. And that small human gesture echoed louder than any rifle shot. It whispered a question none of them could shake. If this is the enemy, then who are we fighting? The question lingered like smoke in the morning air, impossible to grasp, impossible to wave away. It was late autumn when the answer began to take shape, not through words, but through an act so unexpected that even the most hardened among them could only stare. The day began like any other, dawn light cutting across the plain, boots crunching frost, cattle lowing beyond the fences. But before the morning chores could begin, the sound of a truck broke the silence. A dust-covered pickup rolled to a stop near the barracks, and stepping out was the rancher, the same one who had watched over them since the first day they arrived. His face was weathered, lined with years of wind and work. In his hand he carried a folder. The prisoners gathered, wary. Rumors of transfer or release had flickered through the camp before, always false alarms. But this time the rancher's tone was different. "War's nearly over," he said, his voice steady. "Some of you will be going home soon." A murmur rippled through the ranks, a sound of relief twisted with fear. Home. The word no longer meant what it used to. Then came the part that no one understood. The rancher opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Deeds, not symbolic, real. He gestured toward a fenced parcel beyond the grazing fields, maybe a few acres of rough earth. "You've worked this land like it was your own," he said quietly. "Now it is, for as long as you're here." At first, no one moved. Kazuo blinked, certain his translation was wrong. A few laughed, nervously, thinking it a cruel joke. But the rancher's eyes didn't waver. "My boy," he began, voice thickening, "he fought in the Pacific. Didn't come back." The words hung heavy. "Before he left, he told me something. Said the only way to end hate is to put your hands in the same dirt as the man you're told to hate." He paused, looking at the men in front of him. "You boys already done that, so I figure he'd want this." No one spoke. The prisoners looked from the papers to the land, to the old man standing with his hat in his hands, and back again. Gratitude battled disbelief. The same country that had burned their cities was now offering them ownership, not as payment, not as manipulation, but as trust. Hiroshi, the fisherman who had helped deliver the calf, was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, eyes on the soil. His boots sank into the frost-softened ground. He knelt. With one trembling hand, he dug his fingers into the dirt and lifted a small handful. The earth was cool, grainy, alive. He held it close, staring as though it might dissolve if he breathed too hard. His lips moved, but the words came out only as a whisper, a name or maybe a prayer. Then, softly, a single word in Japanese, "Home." Others followed, hesitant but drawn by something magnetic. Some smiled, others wept. The disbelief turned to silence, and the silence to awe. The cowboys watched from a distance, hats lowered, saying nothing. That evening, the rancher walked past the barracks again. He stopped at the fence where Kazuo stood staring out over the new plot. "You think it's strange," the rancher said quietly. "An enemy giving you land." Kazuo nodded. "Yes," he said, "but maybe not enemy anymore." The rancher smiled faintly, adjusting his hat. "Good," he murmured. "Then maybe my boy was right." And as the last light faded over the fields, the prisoners looked out at the land they had been given, not as captives, but as men standing at the edge of something vast and human. But not all of them could accept it. For some, the gift of land was not a blessing, but a wound. The night after the rancher's visit, silence hung heavy over the barracks. The men sat around the dim glow of a single lantern, faces carved with shadow and conflict. Outside, the cattle slept, the air cool and still, but inside, unease stirred like an unspoken storm. To some, the deed meant dignity. To others, it meant betrayal. One man, Sergeant Nakamura, refused to eat the next morning. A career soldier, he had fought in China, the Philippines, and the islands before capture. His loyalty to the emperor was carved into his bones. "You think this land is a gift?" he said, his voice brittle with anger. "It's bait. They want us tame. They want us to forget what we are." He turned his face from the tin plate before him and whispered, "I'd rather starve than eat from the enemy's hand." Hiroshi tried to reason with him. "It isn't about forgetting, it's about surviving." But Nakamura's eyes hardened. "Survival is not honor." He pushed his food away. That night, Hiroshi heard the faint rumble of his stomach in the bunk beside him and the slow, stubborn rhythm of a man refusing mercy. As days passed, the tension spread like drought through the camp. The men were divided, not by rank or age, but by belief. Some began tending to the soil immediately, drawn to the simple act of growth. Others stood apart, arms crossed, watching with quiet disdain. Even among those who worked, shame clung to them like dust. Every seed they planted felt like treachery whispered into the ground. When letters arrived, the weight of that shame deepened. Paper was scarce, but words came easily. Too easily for the censors back in Japan, who would surely read every line. "What can we write?" Kazuo asked one evening. "That we are fed? That we work the land? That the Americans let us rest under their trees? He hesitated, staring at the blank sheet before him. If my brother reads this, he will curse my name. Another man tore up his paper entirely. We are already ghosts, he muttered. Why remind them we still breathe? Yet even in that silence, hope fought to grow. One evening, as the sun slipped low over the fence line, the oldest among them, a gray-haired man named Maury, rose to speak. He had been a farmer before the war, long before uniforms and commands. His hands were calloused in a way no weapon could explain. I once planted in the shadow of my father's anger, he said softly. He told me that every crop must earn its right to grow, that the soil forgives nothing. But when I returned to the field after our first war, I found something strange. The land did not care who won or lost. It only remembered who returned to till it. The barracks grew quiet. Maury's eyes glimmered in the lantern light. If they let you grow something, he continued, it's not charity. It's belief. Belief that you still can. No one spoke for a long time. Then, slowly, men began to rise. The next morning, when the rancher came to the fields, he found them already at work. Not all, but enough. They planted with trembling hands, each motion a fragile act of defiance, not against their captors, but against despair itself. And for the first time, the shame of surrender began to loosen its hold, replaced by something quieter, sturdier, the will to grow again. The first green shoots broke the soil in late spring, thin, trembling, barely there, but alive. The men gathered around the rows in silence, some kneeling to press fingers into the damp earth. They had done this. With borrowed tools and calloused hands, with shame still in their throats and dust still on their boots, they had coaxed life from American soil. And something inside them shifted. The war was not over, but it no longer felt like the only thing that defined them. Kazuo stood back, arms crossed, squinting beneath the brim of a borrowed straw hat. He watched the others weed between stalks and adjust irrigation ditches, their movements more confident now. The land had softened them, but they had also shaped it in return. A rancher ambled over, chewing on a piece of straw, boots coated in mud. He nudged Kazuo with his elbow and nodded at the growing crops. "You know," he drawled. "You're better at this than half my nephews." Kazuo blinked, then smiled faintly. He didn't have the words to reply, but the compliment struck deeper than he expected. Respect from a cowboy. That summer, the fields became something else entirely, not just rows of food, but symbols of a strange and shared resilience. The prisoners had begun blending the methods they knew from home with the practices taught by the ranchers. They built furrows, narrower than the Americans had used, conserving water in the scorching heat. They adjusted the timing of irrigation, taking cues from the cycles of moisture in the soil, something they had learned from rice paddies and volcanic hills. One cowboy stood with his arms crossed, watching the changes unfold. "Didn't think of that," he muttered, nodding approvingly as a prisoner adjusted a trench to better direct runoff. "Smart." The Americans began asking questions instead of giving orders. They watched the prisoners' techniques and started implementing them in their own fields. The land became a common teacher, a shared text written in soil and sweat. There were fewer fences now, not the physical ones, but the invisible kind. At night, the guards didn't pace as much. The prisoners didn't flinch as often. Sometimes they played harmonica tunes after supper, the sound drifting over the dry plains. The cowboys listened from a distance. One even tapped his boot in rhythm, hidden behind the stables. And on one early morning in July, as the sky began to lighten and the horizon bled orange and gold, Kazuo and the rancher found themselves standing at the edge of the field together. Neither spoke. The air was still. Insects buzzed lazily in the grass. Rows of corn rustled under a gentle breeze. Side by side, two men, once enemies by law, by uniform, by duty, stared out at a shared harvest. The rancher reached down, pulled a stalk, and stripped it with practiced ease. "Good crop," he said quietly. "Real good." Kazuo nodded. Then, without thinking, he said in halting English, "Because we made together." The rancher looked over at him, surprised. Then he chuckled and nodded. "Yeah, together." No other words passed between them. None were needed. The war had taken much, family, pride, country. But in this quiet moment, in the middle of nowhere, among rows of corn and borrowed hope, something else had been returned. Not victory, not forgiveness, but something just as rare, understanding. It came slowly, in the way soft rains change a dry season, almost unnoticed until the ground drinks so deeply it forgets it was ever cracked. And now the prisoners were told they could write home. For many it had been over a year since surrender, since shame, since they had touched the language of their loved ones. Now a pencil and paper felt heavier than a rifle. The barracks filled with the quiet scratch of graphite. No shouting, no orders, just the sound of men trying to bridge two impossible worlds. Some stared at the blank page for hours. Others began, only to crumple the sheet and start over. Takashi, a former schoolteacher from Hiroshima, sat at the edge of his bunk and wrote slowly. The words were uncertain, but honest. He addressed his wife, her name written with reverence. He told her of the land, of the way crops had grown under his hands, of the silence in the early morning when the sun warmed the fence line. Then he added something he had never imagined he would say. "I now believe in second chances." When he reread the sentence, his eyes stung. He wasn't sure if it was pride or guilt that burned hotter. Around him, others were writing too. Hiroshi folded his letter tightly, pressing it flat with the palm of his hand. Kazuo tucked his between the pages of his farm notes, as if it were another entry in the strange, unfolding journal of his survival. But some couldn't bring themselves to send the truth. Nakamura, ever rigid, sat with folded arms. "Write what?" he snapped. "That we eat well? That we farm like American peasants?" He laughed bitterly. "My family would rather I were dead than fed by the enemy." There was truth in his anger. Rumors said letters were read by Japanese intelligence, censored, copied, and studied for weakness. Stories of kindness were considered poison, a psychological contagion. And still, the prisoners wrote. Back in Tokyo, the letters confused officials. One general reportedly asked if the reports were forged. Another dismissed them as signs of cowardice. But the words were real. They spoke of sweat and seeds, of biscuits and black coffee, of kindness that came not in grand gestures, but in the ordinary rhythm of daily work. And yet, behind every sentence was a fear. What if no one believed them? What if their wives tore the envelopes in half? What if their sons spit on their names? Still, they wrote, because silence was a lie, too. One evening, after the letters had been collected, the men sat outside and watched the guards gather them into a satchel. A young American soldier paused before tying it shut. "You write good things?" he asked Kazuo. Kazuo met his eyes and, after a pause, nodded. "Yes, good things. And true." The soldier gave a small, almost embarrassed smile and tapped the canvas bag. "Hope they get there." Kazuo didn't answer. He just looked out at the horizon, where the sky stretched wide and orange and filled with the ache of something both ending and just beginning. They didn't know if their words would survive the censors. They didn't know if their families would ever read them. But the act of writing, of telling the truth as they had lived it, was its own quiet defiance. And as the sun dipped behind the fields, they had worked with their own hands. They began to understand that the most radical thing they could carry home might not be proof of survival, but proof of grace. The announcement came at dawn, a sharp whistle. Then the voice of the camp commander, echoing across the yard like a ghost, pulling them back to a life they had almost forgotten. The war was over. The emperor had surrendered. The ships were waiting. They were going home. But the word no longer stirred relief. It stirred fear. They packed in silence, rolled shirts into bundles, folded blankets they would not be allowed to keep. One man knelt beside the small vegetable patch he had tended for months, pressing his palm into the soil as if trying to memorize it. Kazuo stood at the edge of the field, his journal clutched to his chest, watching the way the wind swept across the corn one last time. Hiroshi said nothing as he tucked something small into the lining of his bag, a pouch of earth scooped from the edge of the field at sunrise. When they boarded the trucks, there were no cheers, no goodbyes, just nods between men who had come to understand one another without ever truly speaking the same language. The cowboys watched from the fences, some tipping their hats. One leaned against a post, arms crossed, eyes lowered. The trucks rolled down the dirt road, then onto pavement. They passed the edge of the property, past the rows they had planted, the barns they had painted, the animals they had fed. And then, past all of it, they left the land behind. The voyage across the Pacific was long and strangely quiet. No one asked what awaited them. They already knew. When they stepped off the ship in Yokohama, the air was thick with rot and smoke. The port had been flattened, warehouses like skeletons, cranes twisted like broken fingers. The city was worse. Entire districts were nothing but rubble, the bones of homes scattered beneath scorched steel. Children picked through garbage piles, barefoot. Mothers stood in ration lines that stretched through bomb craters. The prisoners, now returnees, were marched through streets that looked nothing like memory. Their uniforms had been taken years ago, their weapons lost. But it wasn't that which made the people stare. It was their faces, full. The suspicion came fast. "Why do you look healthy?" one woman asked Takashi on the train. "Why do your boots still have soles?" a man hissed. At the processing center, one bureaucrat looked over Kazuo's papers and said flatly, "So you lived well while the rest of us ate weeds." No one asked what he had done to survive. They only saw what he looked like now. The shame came back, heavier than before. Not for surrender, but for having lived well when so many had not lived at all. Some returnees refused to speak of their captivity. Others lied, said it had been hard, brutal, silent, said nothing of the fields, nothing of the land, nothing of the kindness. But Hiroshi kept the pouch of soil hidden beneath the floorboards of the burned house he returned to. Each night he took it out, held it in both hands. It reminded him not just of survival, but of the moment he had remembered he was still human. And that small weight of Texas dirt, carried across oceans and war, became the only thing he trusted to tell the truth. Years later, the war existed only in yellowed photographs and the trembling hands of those who survived it. Japan had rebuilt, cities reborn in steel and glass, but for the men who had once worn prisoner tags in America, the past never quite let go. It lived in the small rituals of their days, the way they tended gardens, the way they turned soil before rain, the way they bowed slightly before planting anything new. To most, they were simply old men who loved the earth. Only they knew what that reverence meant. Kazuo became a teacher after the war, lecturing on agricultural engineering. His students thought his obsession with irrigation bordered on fanaticism. His insistence that soil remembers kindness sounded poetic, even absurd. But every time he drew diagrams of rotating furrows or spoke of water as life, he was back in that Texas field, the sun beating down, a cowboy standing beside him saying, "You're better at this than half my nephews." Others had taken different paths. Takashi returned to Hiroshima and began helping to restore the farmland outside the city's ruins. People whispered about his time in captivity, but he never defended himself. Instead, he planted rice with bare hands, never wearing gloves again. When asked why, he said softly, "Because I was taught that to touch soil with your skin is to make peace with it." Hiroshi, the fisherman-turned-farmer, never stopped carrying that small pouch of Texas earth. He kept it on a shelf beside his family altar between a candle and a black-and-white photograph of his wife. Each morning he would light the candle, bow once, and whisper, "Arigato." Not to a god, not to a flag, but to the memory of a place that had shown him dignity when he thought he had none left. Over the years, stories of the POW farms in America began to surface. Scholars wrote about them. Newspapers mentioned them in quiet features buried beneath headlines. Eventually, one former prisoner, a soft-spoken man named Sato, published a memoir titled Fields of the Enemy. It described the smell of American corn, the feel of Texan dust, the laughter of men who had once been told they could never laugh again. The book was translated into English and became required reading in a handful of American classrooms. One student, after finishing it, wrote in the margin, "They were enemies, but they were also gardeners." Decades passed, and the men aged into memory, but the soil remained. In the late 1960s, an invitation arrived in Japan, a cultural exchange, a program between American and Japanese farmers to share techniques, research, and tradition. Kazuo, now gray-haired and walking with a cane, was among those chosen to attend. When his plane touched down in Dallas, he felt the same heat, the same scent of dry earth that had once wrapped around him in captivity. The next morning, they drove him out to a ranch on the edge of a small Texas town. It wasn't the same place. The old camp had long been dismantled, but the fields looked familiar. The air shimmered gold with the same light he had known as a young man. He stepped down slowly from the truck, his cane sinking into the soil. The American farmer who greeted him was the grandson of the man who once handed out those first work gloves. "Welcome back," he said simply. Kazuo smiled. His voice trembled. "It never left me," he replied. Then, slowly, he knelt. His knees cracked, his hands pressed into the dirt, and for a long moment he didn't move. The soil was warm, gritty, alive. When he lifted his palm, a small clump crumbled between his fingers, scattering in the wind. He looked up toward the rising sun and whispered, "It remembers." And in that single breath, across decades and oceans, it truly did. If you made it this far, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share your country or city. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story moved you, please tap the like button, hit subscribe just below this video, and click the little notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our forgotten WWII archives. With your support, we can keep bringing these stories to life, one forgotten moment at a time.